So here we are, plenary session. So I invite all the speakers to come to the floor, please. I don't have a PhD, so maybe it's good I'm speaking now. Maria made me notice I didn't introduce myself. I'm Matteo Lucchetti. It's okay. And I'm a curator at BAC. Maybe I should go in front. So it's quite a responsibility to try to manage a plenary session. I think not everybody has been diligent enough, sorry. It's a coercive plenary session. So, please, everybody's here, wonderful. So, I was saying it's a big responsibility because many things, there's to use a saying, there's a lot of food for thought, of course. But also, I think it's important to try to go back to the initial questions that Tom was posing at the beginning of this. So, namely, trying to address in a bit more maybe systematic way what is the legacy, or as Jakob has framed it in a nice way, the unfinished business that was left from the 70s, and to see if there's any of this material that can be still useful today. Also looking at all of this through the lenses that have been offered today through the two panels. But also like to try to think how all these elements, thanks also to the last complementary notes by Pelin, how space in general, so architecture of course, but the creation, construction and development of space around the education system, how this element can actually contribute to empower education systems, education pedagogies in general. So going back to a little bit and also it's also the moment I'm very aware where you know, everybody is that have been maybe thinking about questions, have urgent issues to maybe ask to the speakers can do that. I also invite people to come closer, because we have like 2 rows of empty seats as usual in these occasions because of this shyness of not being too close to the speakers. But actually, I think after all have been said today, I think these 2 empty rows are quite heavy to have, I think. But so any of you that is happy to bridge the gap by starting physically to come a bit closer is more than welcome, I think. But you don't have to ask questions, you just, you know, bridge the gap in certain ways. So we start not metaphorically. I don't want also to speak too much. I just want to have a quote also, because I think each of us, when it comes to education, has a very personal and specific background, a formation, no? that is very much tied, as we have seen, to the narrative of a state. A state is also another element we should discuss. What kind of role has the state today within these narratives? So we have seen now in the Learning Laboratories, the state was the main initiator of all these educational projects, most of the educational projects, sometimes speaking from very different narratives. But what is the role of the state today, for example, where in the university we have been looking at, for example, in the cases that Tom was presenting today, are actually acting as corporations. They speculate on the financial market, and then the mismanagement of these moves are paid by the students. So where is the state in all of this? So, but again, I was saying the personal formation is also tied to perhaps a national narrative. So coming from Italy, I've always, when it comes to these issues, I always have a case that by no wonder is coming from 1967, so we're still revolving around those years. It's this small school called Barbiana, School of Barbiana, initiated by a priest, a revolutionary priest, was not well accepted by the church. It was actually fought by Vatican a lot. And he started his experiment that was called Barbiana School. Barbiana was the name of the community, where he established this horizontal model where the students were actually teachers with him, and they were like revisiting the whole like state mandate of what these kids that were in primary school were meant to get to know and to be taught about. And when the priest was about to, they wrote books together. And when the priest was about to die, the 8 students decided to write a book that is called Letter to a Teacher. And there are many points that they wanted to tell to a teacher that was not part of this community experience. And one of them was this. I was learning so many things while I taught, for instance, that others' problems are like mine. So to come out of them together is good politics. To come out alone is stinginess. So I think, let's practice good politics. Let's maybe speak about politics while teaching. And that's how I would like to open the floor to questions, the most burning ones that I'm sure are hovering in the room because, of also the last contribution of Pelin. So the floor is officially open to questions. Otherwise, I will ask Tom to go back to point 1. So can we gather a few questions? There are any questions in the room? One up there. Sorry, we don't have so many mics, so I will entertain the audience while the person is bringing the microphone to the last floor. Or, there you go.
Hi, thank you for the wonderful day. I have a question that was triggered by Pelin Tan, so I will direct it to her, but anyone who wants to contribute, please feel welcome. I was interested in this erasure that was happening in Turkey to so many people, academicians and so on. And it's also seeing the camera technicians time to time disappear behind the curtain to go back to the other camera makes one thing what happens to the ones that are erased. And I was watching one of the street lectures given by one of the academicians recently got fired, Süheyla Karacabey. She was giving a lecture on the street about Brecht's epic intervention. And I thought it suddenly makes so much sense to talk about this. And so outside of the academy, the situation does something to knowledge as well, and what it truly means. And I was wondering if you have more in your head that can be done outside the academia, perhaps something a bit more than immediately gathering interested people and continuing the curriculum or these common interests. But the erased people are now so many, we can reverse the systematics. It almost we have more variable academician outside of the academia now. So I was wondering if you would maybe elaborate on what might be a practice outside the academy.
So this inside, outside an institution, but also referring to very practical aspect of being outside. Maybe we gather another question, and then if there are any other questions, so that we can have another one there.
This question is maybe directly for Tom, but I think applicable to everybody.
Which Tom?
Tom Hollert. There's been a lot of talk about the neoliberalization of school, but I think when, Matteo, when you mentioned that the majority of these case studies in the exhibition are state-led or public, let's say, I think that this maybe can shine a new dimension on what's happening today, particularly in the United States, but I think all over. Whereas, you're seeing radical experimentation in these spaces and pedagogies of primary and, let's say, this might be, let's say, not higher, but say sub-higher education. But you're seeing this primarily in the private realm, to the point where in the United States, we're privatizing effectively everything if DeVos comes into power. So I was wondering if something can maybe be reflected upon the urgency of going back to these models that, while they are so inspiring, they do come from a radically different or seemingly radically different institutional situation as we have today in politics?
Thank you very much for the question. That will also help us to go back to the main issues of that Tom was posing with this symposium. So maybe Pelin, if you want to answer the first question.
I will answer partially because we are under record. Okay, some things I will tell you later. Okay, I think non-institutional lecturing, teaching, I mean outside teaching is not new in Turkey. There was Özgür University in the end of 90s. I don't know, you heard that, you remember that? Özgür University, free university. Özgür University was more Kurdish movement, leftist Kurdish movement. University was established in Ankara and Istanbul. And it was very active in 92, 93, 94 when I was student. And I went also this university too. So it was for free, and many professors who were expelled in the 80s military junta regime, they were teaching in this place. And they were teaching, some of them were teaching also in the university, but some of them they were teaching only there. So this was one practice, and there was many that Eğitimsen is organizing. Eğitimsen is the union that we are members, academic union, official academic union. They organize something like that, and then there is another during and after Gezi occupation in the parks, not after the parks that people gathered, not this one, but more further, 1 year later, that started lecturing, like reading together, and like in Union Square after post-Occupy in New York, there was similar practices. People read together, and they lecture, they put a lecture topics and so on. So it's not a new practice, this alternative teaching or teachers who were expelled from governmental position. Or being arrested and released, and there is already in Turkey going on something like that. And this one is what is going on since weeks, lecturing in public space by the lecturers. The lecturers are the people who are expelled recently because they are either pro-Kurdish or leftist or alternative and so on. I mean, there is two things. One is you can romanticize, of course. It's an important space, meeting outside, meeting in a different spaces, and running a pedagogical structure, because we know that the only pedagogy doesn't exist in an institution, doesn't exist in a university. But then the non-romantic side is that they don't have a salary, they don't have even health insurance anymore, and they don't have retirement. Even the government, Turkish government, is now trying to erase the right of retirement too. So this is also the bad side. For my side, in my opinion, I mean, we have to all resign. I mean, if those people are going to be on the street and no job and not to teach anymore, I don't find this. I mean, it's very politically correct to go and help them and run together something. This is why I don't do that. If I want to do something, I just go and resign. I mean, this is to become in the same situation, to leave my rights of salary, this and that. So this is one my opinion. So I don't want to. I mean, I'm a member of this group. I don't want to romanticize so much. Yes, it gives a lot of potentialities of thinking in different kind of spaces of pedagogy and methods of pedagogy, and is a form of solidarity also. But at the other side, we have to find sustainable solidarity forms, or we go and resign altogether. That's the.
Thank you, Pelin. So maybe we go back to the second question and also to Tom in order to go back to the original questions and see how we can update them as we go.
Yes, well, the question of how. I'm just put it there. to what extent or in what way the state's commitment to or engagement with education as an progressive project has changed is really crucial, I think. And first of all, I think we all agree that in the fact that the state or that the nature of the state has quite radically changed from the 60s, say, to today. So it's a different apparatus altogether, and it is apparatus which has been in earlier times much less dictated, marked by capitalist interest directly. I mean, there were of course. I mean, there was always this connection, and but it was a different relationship between capital and state that was, of course, not without problems. We all know that, but it left a certain, let's say, agency to the state to decide how its organs, how its different branches interpret the challenge that was perceived as a crisis in education in the post-war decades. A crisis mainly or largely due to the fact that the population, that the demographics have changed, and that there was this need for the big mass to be educated in a heretofore unknown or scale. So there was a certain willingness, or that's what I see from, or what is part of the findings of this research. There was a certain willingness to adopt or to allow experimental, even radical strategies of reading space, reading education within spaces, reading the idea of the subject as learner, as self-learner, in ways that almost that were surprisingly close to what, from today's perspective, would be regarded as an all too radical practice, as for a state being capable to accommodate, or for stately institutions capable to accommodate. And this was a very uneven landscape, of course. The exhibition might mislead in this direction, as there weren't these experimental spaces all over the place, but it was they were here and they were there, and they were particularly progressive ways of planning and then also enacting schooling and learning processes. But there was also a kind of rather consolidating mainstream of conservative education around. This was also an ideological battle fought within the countries of Western Europe and of the United States, and so there is it would be a misinterpretation to have to read this time as one of kind of experimentation, pedagogical or educational experimentation taking place all over. There is from speaking of the private school, private education today, and of their ability or interest in experimenting with educational concepts, educational models. This of course caters to a particular cliency, and so there's an enlightenment middle class and upper class, which is as long as the efficiency of these models is being proved somehow, would be open to have their children be educated in such a rather open situation. But the moment the desired results are not being presented, the same kind of experimental systems or experimental models would be territorialized again and made into something that is less difficult to understand as being a effective way of teaching and learning.
We have a question here.
I'm wondering, I didn't unfortunately see the exhibition, but I'm wondering if I look at the content of the exhibition, which is education, but the exhibition itself is also an educational tool, and this symposium is an educational tool. If there are any ideas from that period, the late 60s, early 70s, that have also affected the organization and the layout of what it is that you do. I mean, the only thing I noticed was that the first panel was sitting behind tables, behind microphones. The second panel was sitting in front of the tables, and now it's a cozy corner. So I'm wondering.
Quite cold still.
Well, yes, this is the good point. Really, I mean, it's hard for me to. I mean, I think that brings us back to the kind of spatial conditions of educational settings like this. There are certain conditions we simply cannot dismantle as so quickly, and there's a certain program inscribed in the space, in the space we're here, and also in the space of the exhibition, of course. And I think it is. We probably didn't manage to kind of fulfill all the expectations which might be brought here in order to kind of open or to kind of differently structure such an event like this one. But we tried to. I mean, we tried to do this in the exhibition. That's to the extent it was possible. So, well, yes, really I don't have an answer to this. I'm not completely satisfied with this setting either.
Okay, working with what we have, I would just try to do an exercise, try to create a bridge between presentations and reconnect also to the early questions. Because, for example, one idea that comes out of the exhibition is this idea of how the spatial construction is pivotal to the creation of a new model. So the architectural element is very much present. But it's also true that I think in almost none of the cases, but maybe Tom, you can correct me, it's like in this thinking about the space was the idea, for example, that Nana was speaking about of epistemological violence that is entrenched, is embedded within many schools, maybe most of the schools, if not all. How it was certainly not a point to be considered within the creation of the spaces that we have on show in the 70s projects. And I want to refer to also what Kasper was talking about, this beautiful unapologetic didactic elements where you say, knowing the why of the revolution, but wanting to know the how. So how, and in this case, can perhaps the construction of a space respond to this how? For instance, and I'm also would like to bridge it to what Pelines showed us, like with Campus in Camps in Palestine, this concrete tent. So this idea, this the most temporary nomadic element that is the tent is transformed into a concrete element. Of course, is also an artistic gesture on one hand, but on the other is also this idea of the need of a space that is more that becomes a shelter. So perhaps the institution can still be and represent a shelter to have certain emancipatory practices to happen, to take place. So I'm trying to make this bridge also because I think it's important at this stage to try to connect these beautiful presentations that have so much in common, but maybe we need to dig a bit in order to. So Sorry, I will put myself here so I see also this side.
Thank you indeed, all of you, for your talks. I thought that maybe the day wasn't so coherent on and off, but at the end I did think that there was a nice way of it rounding itself to something that Maria at the very beginning outlined. And I'm kind of reading between the lines a little bit. Maybe it's useful to bring in the oppositional pedagogies and oppositional exhibition practices of Central and Eastern Europe during exactly the Cold War as something quite related to what we find Polish or Turkish academics having to do, and those in Palestine and in other places right now. But Maria also said at the beginning that we're implicated, that there is a certain ambivalence in all of this. And I would like to refer to the very first slide that Tom Hullard showed us of the library in Trinity College Dublin, sort of standing for an attempt to create an open architecture for such communal learning. Yet it is, in a way, a rather brutalist building in the space that was the colonial center of learning and of power on that island for centuries. And some people here have remarked on the sort of counter-hegemonic education practices that have gone on well before 1970, and the Irish hedge schools would be a very good example of that. Criminal as they were, if one was found out to have gathered in the hedges, literally even without a tent, and speaking the Irish language and actually taking into the modern time learning of Greek and Latin texts, sort of the canon that was preserved in Irish monasteries, and once they were broken up in the hedges, literally. That's a practice that I think can, that is far from romantic, but can sort of give us hope, or also point to a repetition in history. And in fact, maybe one more example should be noted that's directly connected to these Irish hedge schools, and that's Joseph Boyce's Free International University for Interdisciplinary Research, which he wanted to set up in Ireland, first in buildings that he toured in 1974, and then thought, okay, no, building is not right. We have to make it a kind of a rhizomatic network of people, and that is probably why that network of people still exists, and is a model not just for Ahmed Ud's Silent University, but actually some old fogies in Amsterdam are still holding up the flag, and people in Ireland and elsewhere still call themselves the FIU.
Thank you. So, if the panel wants to respond, Jakob?
It's more a reflection on the whole event. I think it's been really interesting. But I also think I'm missing like a critique of the term pedagogy in a way. I went to school in the 70s in almost something that reminded me, something I recognized in Tom's exhibition, these kind of open plan schools. And I hated school. And the more my teachers tried to understand me, the more I hated school. And then eventually they took me out of class, and I had to spend time with some, I think they were psychologists, and they were like doing the reason why I couldn't spell. And then eventually they said, yeah, we need some plumbers in this world. And that was me. And that's why of course what saved me was the punk movement. It's like, fuck off to teachers, fuck off to, there was this kind of, it's not ACAP, but ATAP, all teachers are bastards. And I really understood that. And that's why I think it's, when I remember there was this movement called like Kids Power or Children's Power, and their motto was, who needs pedagogy? The people in power. So I think every time I hear the word pedagogy, I can't even, I think about someone who wants me to do something. in a very specific way, someone to form me, shape me, push my body in a certain direction. And I think there's been this kind of use of radical pedagogic, and I also I'm just thinking of extreme pedagogic in a way, like people who like totalitarianism in a way. And that would be interesting somehow to get a more close understanding when we use this term. At least I'm getting like having tics, maybe due to my experience in the 70s.
And maybe it's not only the people that shape us, but also, of course, what the exhibition very much suggests is that the spaces shape us, of course, and also concepts shape us. So it's on one hand that I look through the exhibition and they're kind of like full of this, let's call it school without walls. Let's call it open spaces. But at the same time, of course, what we also know, all these spaces have been also incorporated in a flexibilized schooling system. They are here in Utrecht, in the secondary schools. And they put it even more. They put wheels on the chairs and on the tables so they can move around. And in a way, it looks like office buildings also. So that is one thing. And then the other thing is, of course, also when we look to concepts again, so how they shape us, the self-centered learning is one of them that has been kind of incorporated and let's call it appropriated from European policy papers on lifelong learning. So this is something that has kind of like, in one way, taken through, and they have read the radical pedagogues very closely. The learning webs are in there, the self-centered learning. But actually because I did the exercise over summer, like trying to read through some of these policy papers, and I like really failed. But nevertheless, at a certain point, I was also thinking, okay, so I could now go on in this gloomy situation, but also what didn't they take? So, and this is maybe also something which brings us back again to the question, what is left? And there is for sure the moment of politicization that is, these papers are depoliticized. They took everything that is possible to kind of like take out, the human capital, basically. And
highly politicized,
yeah, isn't it? Yeah, absolutely. But then, like, how can we bring in that back to kind of not lose on the self-determined learning? Because in a way, I feel like I cannot use it anymore. So this is like a completely individualized moment, but how can we try to find a way to link it back to a collectivized learning and collectivity, and finding ways to engage in a for sure impossibility. I really like when Maria said at the beginning, as if it would be possible. But at the same time, I think it's even a step before that we have to engage in impossibilities and have to understand like how we are like countering such an impossibility.
Okay, in the back.
René.
Oh, there's someone in the upstairs.
Oh, thanks. Sorry. I just wanted to ask about, we talked about real estate of education and we talked about spaces and places, but I keep thinking about territories in the sense of urban, because if I hear the panels, it's very urban oriented. And if I look at, let's say, the recent crisis in my own country, there's a bit of a struggle between the urban and the rural. Mm-hmm. And so what about education and our capacity to work in those places?
Thank you. Maybe we gather another question from above. Right.
Oh, thank you. Just want to start, thank you so much for this beautiful day. I actually have two questions. I don't know if it's going to be too much. One is I'm originally from Brazil. I was educated there, and I don't know if you are aware of what's going on there, but we are in a very turmoil time over there, especially in education. We're having an educational crisis. One thing, bad and good thing at the same time, is that the kids are taking over the schools, you know. They're actually like closing the doors, and they are completely organizing, painting the schools, creating their own curriculum and whatnot. From this, one question: how much of the same politics we are reenacting in this colonization approach is that none of the primary or secondary students are participating in this discussion? So how much of exclusion we are replicating in not embracing them in this sort of discussion? This is my first question. What do you think about it? Second is, I haven't heard about I think it was called the anarchist school in the 70s here in the Netherlands. And I just want to know what was this experiment and what do you think was the repercussion of it?
Was there another question next? Yeah.
Yeah, but the question is closely related, and I take up with we have to think about the concepts that we are using. And one of the things that surprised me today was its failure, its problem, its decolonization, its struggle, and it's sort of the same kind of. So are we reenacting the tragedy of our own lives and thinking that we have to solve it as if we are so modernist still? So what do you think of that?
Maybe it's the theater. Okay, who wants to answer first? We have 3 questions, but no answers. Maybe we should continue. More questions? Okay, go ahead.
I'm sure, I think this rural-urban conflict is everywhere right now because there is a lot of crisis of the expansion of urban. And then in many cities there is a urbanization process, but there is no urban. Yeah. There's a division between urban and urbanization process as going on. And then the hinterlands are getting privatized, getting used for big infrastructures. And this transformation of the hinterlands is the end of the agricultural land too. So it's very, I think, common everywhere right now. Maybe it's more acute in China or something, where is housing development or developers are taking over the land. But there are many alternative farmer activists, at least in China I know, in Korea I know, and Taiwan also. They are combining farming, schooling, their own, like sharing knowledge and kind of pedagogical spaces. I'm afraid to use it. So space and as a form of action and solidarity. Not a seek of education, but is more. I had few images I wanted to show, but I couldn't find it. For example, there is a farm in Hong Kong was going to. I told today morning to Jacob too. It was under threat of eviction, but there was a occupation squat movement that they saved the farm, and they turn it into kind of also like meeting people, sharing readings, making fanzines. There are many examples like that. And then there is one very good example in Taiwan, in Taipei, that an urban planning department collaborating with the tea farmers whose farms are being destroyed by the highways, new development of highways. Maybe you know the phenomenon in Taiwan. They are also collaborating as an action, producing kind of space of learning, but at the same time helping the farmer together to produce green tea, good quality green tea, and they're selling it and they're promoting it and so on. So there's I think, I don't know, Latin America maybe too, or in Spain I'm sure too, but I traveled a lot in Asia to meet them. I did some site research and I found many groups, initiatives like that, more focused on the rural, or I would say non-rural or non-urban. It's just focusing on saving the land and saving the old way of agriculture. and also in urban space inside too. I mean, but combining with schooling and teaching each other, not teaching, but kind of sharing readings and lecturing, meeting together, and as a kind of form of solidarity and action, actually, pedagogy as action. I mean.
And I think it's interesting because maybe it's another meaning of the title, the real estate of education, but also it brings the highlight on the fact that real estate development has been, for the last 20, 30 years, the real business of most of the Western countries, creating the conditions for which urban areas or urbanized areas, I don't know if the word exists, are actually very rural in the way they relate to in the way the communities relate to each other, in the way, certain are not people through their education in those places are not exposed to certain, notions. So it becomes new tribalisms being developed within so-called urban areas that are not urban at all. And then that's how you explain Brexit. That's how you explain new populist waves, I think, or at least you can try to attempt to explain the certain dynamics, I think.
In one of the meetings, I said to Jakob, sorry, in one of the meetings in China, they were sharing readings, inspiration of alternative schools, and so I saw Jakob's one of the Hamlet kind of little book or something. They were inspired by Copenhagen Free Academy, and it was in Chinese, and so it was very nice. I was telling him today morning that how I saw that by coincidence. Sorry.
Please.
No, I think
Sorry, Nana. Nana and then Casper.
Go on. I think there is, with the use of that language, failure problem, decolonization, one of the findings on like inclusion and exclusion in higher art education was that particularly students with a rural background were highly problematized, also by teachers. So I think we have to be extremely, and the same in the Netherlands, that these kids who are from the suburbs, who are completely homogenic and are afraid of Rotterdam as a diverse city, etc. I think that's also kind of a stigmatization. And to be more precise, I think another term that is very often imprecise used, and I count myself into that, is the term decolonization. And I'm very glad that you said that you brought the example from Brazil, because it brings me directly to Latin America. So the scholars that I quoted are all from Argentina, Chile, etc. And when we think about decolonization in that context, it is very context specific. It is indigenous knowledge. Yeah. So the indigenous movement is intrinsic, is also deeply connected to what is happening in the schools right now. So I think by using decolonization as a metaphor, we are marginalizing actually the origins and reproduce a form of like just taking something, it sounds great, let's decolonize our institutions, but nobody really knows what we're talking about. And it's, to me, it's more a practice. So for instance, Pilin, when you were in your talk talking about decolonizing yourself in order then to have a ground to do this work, I think it's a constant process. It's not that, we are all colonized, whether you are on the side of those who have been oppressed or on the side of the oppressor. And that is a constant reflection and undoing. And I agree, it is extremely complex and extremely context depending. However, the epistemologies and the kind of ontological grounds on which we're all existing have their systematics in actually the dehumanization of a particular group of people. And I think that is something that remains underestimated in whatever kind of process of pedagogy we want to talk about. And talking further about that subject of the rural, the marginalized, the outside of the institution, I think that that decolonizing work actually has been existing since there is something such as oppression. So when you think about maroon culture, I'm really intrigued, of course, as many people, by Stefano Hartney's and Fred Moten's undercommons. Like, no, it is not this sort of commons. It's like actually the knowledge that I was talking about today, I did not generate that in school. Yes, I did, of course, my critique, etc., the training, yes. But actually, it was the reading groups that came out of a survival strategy. Otherwise, we would not have, like, a Black Studies reading group. There was not, like, a declared separatism. It was more like, oh my God, like, let's just read something else, and get together and talk about it and find strategies. Is I think something that is not in the institution, and actually also should not be. And I'm making it's a very impulsive statement I just made, but I think there is always there have to be these spaces outside of the institutional frame, because the system itself is oppressive. Yeah, so when these kids in Brazil right now are closing the doors, and there was a speech which actually the another roadmap of art education translated into English. So if you are interested into English, into German, you can find this amazing speech by this young person in the parliament, claiming their rights for decolonizing education, basically. Then I think that it just makes me very hopeful, and I will actually stop there.
Thank you, Kaspar.
Yeah, so this is also the question on language. As resident poet, I feel like I should. So I noticed that you lumped in decolonization with your list of negative terms, including failure, and which felt strange to me as a decision, wondering why decolonization feels like a negative term to you. But beyond that, I think there's been a lot of good work recently in Afro-pessimist theory and queer theory about negativity specifically, and one of the suggestions being there that, and I don't know, this feels relevant to the times that we're in at the moment, which a lot of people have talked about in terms of disillusionment, as in the lifting, the unveiling of the illusions that we've had, and the what feels like this upsurge in racism and in fascism is actually uncovering these things that have always been present, and that in these moments of profound negativity, that's actually just exposing these points, and exposing them has to be the first, I don't know, that's like obviously the first stage in trying to do anything about them. And so I don't know if it feels like people are talking in the language of struggle or in the language of, these points of tension. I feel like that's ultimately a generative, positive thing, that negativity is always, has the potential to be transformed into something positive.
I mean, to maybe problematize it even further, or to drop another rant, or ask maybe kind of a difficult question, or I don't know, is I wonder if any of the today's presenters could refer to an issue that has been quite recently brought, some kind of in many fields. I mean, first is the criticism of post-colonial theory, from which you probably are aware, from Vivek Chiber, the American Indian origin Marxist economist or sociologist, any ways in which the it's a complex argument he builds, but anyways that the just to give some examples that that are kind of problematic is that the and it also appears in literary criticism a little bit, is that the post-colonial narrative is actually now being used by the conservatives. And it's also the case of Turkey, in which the politicians are talking about Turkish people having an indigenous kind of being different from Europeans, and that we are special. Putin is talking about that as well, that we have traditional, and we stick to tradition, and it's something positive. So, and obviously in feminist theory, Nancy Fraser has been a long-time critic of identity politics, which apparently is kind of a similar thing. And it was perfectly embedded by and taken over by the consumer global capitalism, which is all embraced the identity politics, not necessarily working for empowerment or respect. And similarly with the post-colonial theory that is now, as I said earlier, becoming now and that it is kind of a problematic issue that maybe modernism and colonialism sometimes actually might have brought improvement of the exclusion, exploitation, and as a matter, there is also, I forgot the name of the scholar who wrote a book about, it goes something like, did the xenophobia in India before the colonization of India, did it exist or not? And there is no evidence that before the colonization it was all kind of indigenous society that worked perfectly. Actually, in some cases it might have been more oppressive. Of course, in some other cases, the modernization might have brought different forms of oppressions, or actually might have improved the situation. Sorry about making that long.
We running a bit out of time. Is there other questions another question we can gather?
There was
one there. Galit, maybe? No. Or Andrea. Okay, we have Galit and Andrea, and then we have the last round of answers.
I want to react quickly when you talk
Galit, the mic, please. Sorry.
I want to react quickly because you replace ingenuity with authenticity. I think you don't really make the differentiation, and there is. So but in general, we are sitting here in the orthodox place, talking about different heterodoxies, doing the process of colonizing different processes that developed out of need. So it showed that there is a need here, but the question is to look at other solutions that happen in another situation. It is the place that we need to dig and to find a solution, because we're taking like a method of alternative studies or homeschooling that was in Kosovo, for example. People couldn't go to school; they were banned to go to school, so they had to create the school, the homeschooling. So it's no one from Kosovo now to talk about this experience or to theorize, because nobody said and wrote about it, but this is a project that developed out of need. So are we going to take all the heterodox, I would say, I prefer to call it in this way, and to bring them again to the center, to the orthodoxy, and use them like the decolonizing, that basically replace or put a camouflage of looking at the problem, or replacing can't be not the center anymore. This is will be the process of decolonizing the center. It's to be able not to be in the center and to let a process of decolonization to happen, because then the center say, oh, I need to be decolonized again. So it's the disability to move aside and not to be the subject of the discussion all the time. And I think this is what's happening also here in a certain way. And maybe this is the place that we need to work through it.
Okay, last contribution here from Andrea, I guess. That's the last one we can take for the schedule.
I don't really want to be the last word. Maybe you can do it after me. But
just for you.
Thank you. I think I wanted to frame this whole question, and I think it follows on from what Galit's just said, within the context of uneven geographies and temporalities of state formations. So one of the other assumptions has been there is something called the state, and it is something that we understand. And of course, we're talking about super unevenness. So we're talking about some territories emerging into state formations at the same time as in the West, we're approaching a crisis of the state. So I think as educators, who probably between us have quite a lot of power in Western universities, or in universities in different places, and as people that run or have quite a lot of power within arts institutions, we actually have quite a lot of important political decisions to make about the modes through which we use those spaces, the relationship between arts institutions and universities, which we've been majoritively talking about as if they are funded by the state, or despite the real estate of education that Tom brought up at the beginning and the kind of commodification of higher education. That actually we need to take over long-term and rather dull activities around administration and management in order to think through the possibilities of using these institutions to reformulate within these uneven geographies and temporalities what we want to contribute to a state, and whether we want to go forward with this. It belongs to a more general crisis within left-wing politics. We need to recognise ourselves within that and decide whether we want to identify with it or not. And the last little comment I wanted to say was actually aimed at Jakob, which is to say that punk began in the suburbs. So it was neither in the urbs or in the rural. It was in this kind of limbo state and in the kind of horror vacui of being a teenager in that situation that your anger emerged.
Okay, I think we need to go towards the closing remarks of Tom. I think that's what, yes.
I would rather like to. I mean, I have these 15 minutes in this, and I don't need them at all.
That's good. So we should. Do we want to gather some answers to the last questions, perhaps? Tom, you wanted to say something?
Yes, I wanted to say something again on the language of crisis.
Also, the other Tom. It's okay.
Sorry. Oh, you. Okay.
No, I was nodding and having ideas, but please begin.
You sat in the wrong place.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, I know. Yeah.
No, please.
I can keep.
No, just quickly. This question of how, to what extent we are reenacting earlier former struggles. And what might be the use or the sense or the miss or the dysfunctionality about using terms such as struggle. First of all, I would like to second what Caspar said about what that struggle to me and to many others here isn't a particularly negatively inflected term. And there are very different ways, very different semantics, very different applications of terms such as crisis in relation to education. There never has been in educational theory and educational debate a time without the crisis being written in capital letters. And there is because the crisis, the calling or the naming of a situation as being crisis-ridden is the kind of incentive for all the interested stakeholders to start thinking or to start planning anew, and to start investing anew, and to start gathering money anew in order to improve the educational system. So crisis is really deeply rooted in the discourse in the public discourse of education, and so we have to differentiate between the crisis written in large in these discussions from the crisis we are feeling, we are affected by individually and collectively as something that needs to be addressed with completely different vocabulary, with a different set of strategies, and which is not to be confused with the crisis that leads states and private stakeholders to educational reform or whatever they call it.
Make education great again.
Yeah.
And on this note, we managed not to have Andrea finishing. We managed to have a very current statement. And actually, I'm realizing now that we have officially finished our time for the day. So unless Tom has another urgent thing to wrap up, or if he's happy with like this, I invite you everybody to stay here because drinks will be served here. Yes, and another thing I want, of course, to remind you is that at BAC, this highly debated exhibition that was brought up many times during the day can be seen, can be visited until 9. So if some of you, and it's free entry, so please feel free to browse through the beautiful research that the exhibition is about. And I would like to thank all the speakers once again to bring such intense witnesses of their own work. It was really a privilege, I think, to be here all together to share these experiences with the room. And I think we're gonna continue. I mean, certainly formats needs to be reinvented every time. Sometimes you take them for granted and you need to actually actively put more energies in reinventing them. So I look forward to the next also project at BAC, to seminar. That is also trying a project by Henk Slacker that is involving a lot of artists, curators, practitioners, students in rethinking also spaces for common learning. So please enjoy the night, and thanks again for being here on behalf of all of the panel and BAC. Thank you.